Welcome to the first of the labs that we have for the 507 course. As I'm getting started here, I just want to let you know that I'm just a little bit ahead of where you might be. I have actually already started up the ESXi virtual machine that you would have copied over as part of the workbook Getting Started piece. That was part of the homework piece. But I'm also running on a Mac, so I did run just a little bit ahead, and I just want to point out for anyone who is using a Mac to do these exercises, VMware Fusion works just fine, but when you start up VMware Fusion and open the ESXi host, it will prompt you to enter your password. The reason for that is that the ESXi host is actually able to emulate having lots of network interfaces. And the way that it does this is by essentially accessing it directly and even turning it into promiscuous mode. That's why you're getting this message, because on a Unix host, you need to have particular privileges to be able to do that. If you're doing this over in Windows, it is going to run with administrative privileges. That's how VMware gets installed, so you won't be prompted for this. So you'll only see this if you're on the Mac, but that's okay. You just enter your password and say OK. And at that point, the ESXi box will go ahead and, well, actually probably would have already finished starting up, but it's now accessible. Now, just for now, let me just move that out of the way. So to keep track of where we are in the labs, this lab that we're looking at right now is listed as Exercise 2. That's because Exercise 1 was getting VMware installed, copying all the virtual images over, all those kinds of things. And I've already done everything that's there on page 17, that is the getting the ESXi started, where it might give you a message about the virtual machine having been copied or moved. It really does not matter what you answer to that. And then on page, I said 17, it's actually page 15. And then on page 16, it shows it starting up and even shows that prompt that I just had up that appears in VMware Fusion. Finally, we're over on page 17 now, and we're actually ready to get started in doing the lab. So getting started requires you there on page 17 to take note of the IP address of your ESXi host. So let me just move this back onto the screen for a moment, and you can see that my host is at 192.168.111.153, and this address was assigned by DHCP. It's really important to note that your host will not necessarily have that same IP address, because this IP range is randomly selected by your VMware installation, and then depending how many virtual hosts you have really does control what IP address you're going to get assigned. You do need to take note of that, because you'll need it for all of the rest of the labs. In fact, just to see that we are able to get everything working and know that things are functioning correctly, I'm going to take a look at, there on page 17, it says that we want to take a closer look at the server, and it says that we ought to get our web browser started up. So let me start up my web browser here, and says that we want to connect to that IP address that we saw displayed in the ESXi window. So that IP address for me was http://192.168, http://192.168.111.153 was the one that I got. I'll say OK to that, and I get a message back. Now, this message actually matches what it says in the workbook. If you're using Firefox, you will get a slightly different message. If you're using Safari, you'll get a slightly different message. But look what it says carefully. It's not saying that the page couldn't be found or the server isn't available. It's saying that the certificate that server presented was not valid or not signed. There was some problem with it. In this case, that's expected. This is expected, but not necessarily a good thing, though. As we were talking about in the course, using self-signed certificates or not bothering to issue certificates at all creates a pretty big risk, because what it does is teach the administrators that whenever they want to connect to the host, they're expecting to get the message, and they just say, yeah, that's okay, let me go there anyway, even though it's an invalid certificate. And for some reason my Internet Explorer exited. Maybe I wasn't paying attention there. Let me just reconnect. There it is. Problem with certificate. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm used to the green checkbox being yes, that's okay, but Microsoft made a little change about a year or so ago, and these days if you click the thing that looks like it's going to do it, it actually closes the window. So I want to continue to the website, and now I can see ESXi 5.1. So this is that screen that we were looking at when we were talking in the class, and as we go through this material, there are particular questions we're asking you to look at in the workbook. One of them is this question of why is the use of self-signed certificates a bad practice? That's the second question on page 18. The answer is because we're teaching our administrators bad things, but also there's a risk associated, because by using that, it also opens us up to a man-in-the-middle attack, potentially, where an attacker who has access to part of our infrastructure could begin to sit between our administrator and the virtualization environment and capture real credentials when the administrator tries to connect and accepts a bad certificate. There are more things that are possible to look at here because we're also looking at this raw ESXi box. One of the things that we talked about in the class, we said that it's really not a good idea to have the ESXi host itself, its management interface, its web interface, accessible on your internal network, because that means that potentially anyone could go and connect to it and maybe even get access to some of the files on the system. Now, in the workbook on page 19, that's what it's talking about in steps 6 and 7 and 8. Let's take a look at that. The thing we're looking at here is the Browse Data Stores in the Hosts inventory. And when I click on that, it pops open that username and password window that we said might show up. Now, in your environment, you would not expect what we're about to do to work. But I will tell you, I have seen it work in many environments. And as we talked about in the class, one of the reasons is that administrators will set up the system and maybe think to themselves they should go back and change that password, but once they push everything into the management interface, it never asks for that password again. So it tends to just fall off their radar and get overlooked. So for us, we're just going to try the default password that you'd find for VMware. That would be the username of root with no password at all. And we find that this virtual machine, this server actually lets us right in. Now in this particular virtual machine, when we browse into the data store, there's nothing to see. The reason for that is, of course, that this is a lab exercise, and a bigger reason is that there's already, this virtual machine is already so large, trying to put more virtual machines in it and run that all inside a VMware player on your machine would just be a bad idea. So we haven't set it up with any virtual machines. But that's okay, because to do the exercise, we're much more interested in the configuration of the ESXi box itself, these days called the vSphere virtualized host. So that's going to move us over to page number 20. Because while we can browse around and get access to some things within the web interface, and while it's true that there is these days a nice interface that can actually be used for doing some management of the host itself from the web interface, it's really not the preferred way to manage these hosts. The right way to do it is to use the vSphere client. Now, you will notice that there is a link here that will allow you to click and download the vSphere client. But please don't click that link. If you look at the bottom of my browser bar, you'll see that this link will actually take you to the VMware site. So unless you really want to download it over the internet, which will take some time, you really want to prefer to use the copy of the VMware tool that we have on the DVD. So if I simply go out and go to my DVD, which, I haven't installed here. Okay, that's going to be a problem. Let's see. Well, not a huge problem. I can still get access to it. I actually did create a virtual machine for it, or a hard drive for it, but unfortunately, I forgot that there was no CD installed on this machine. So let me just go out to my network for just 1 second. Alrighty, and out here I do have a copy of this DVD. For you, of course, you'll just be going right to the DVD itself. Where am I going? Disk images, 507. All right. So when you get to that DVD, which I even said, you should probably even just copy everything that's in here right onto your computer. I'm going to do that right now while we're talking. It's probably not great for me to just drop that on my desktop. So let me create a folder for it. This way I won't have to keep going back and finding that. And I can drop that tool off there, I think. All right, there we are. I've already got VMware installed, so I'm not going to copy that again. There we go. Yes, that's okay. And off it goes. So now while that's working, inside of the Tools folder, so when that copies over, let me just come on in here. We're currently up working through day 2. When that finishes up, inside of the Tools folder, we'll find an installer for the vSphere client. The vSphere client is the management interface, the primary management interface that an administrator would use at his desktop to do almost anything that he needs to do on any ESXi host. And it can be used in 2 ways. It can be used to connect directly to an ESXi host unless that host is in lockdown mode. If it's in lockdown mode, you have to go through the management server, the vCenter server, or sit locally at the console of that machine. So that's not practical for us. We're not going to do that in this class. And we also don't have a vCenter server because the licensing for it is quite expensive and not something we can just shell out $4,000 for a demonstration in a lab. However, now that this is copied over, let me go into Tools. The VMware client, though, is used not just for the ESXi hosts itself, but also to connect to that same vCenter server. That means that there's a single unified interface, and the options that are available simply change based on what you're connecting to and what level of licensing you have from VMware. Well, let's go ahead and install this. So I'll simply double-click, close up my network window, and let's get rid of the browser because we're not going to need that again. Oh, I've seen this happen sometimes. You notice that I've got the spinning circle there. I thought maybe I was waiting for something, but if I look down here, see this is flashing? I have seen this happen sometimes, that you'll double click on a tool and it actually needs your attention. It needs you to authorize an activity, but it doesn't bring that authorization window right up into the front. So if you're trying to do an installation and you see that kind of thing happen, just notice down in your bar down here and see if there's a window that wants your attention. Here it happened in Windows 7. I've actually seen that happen more frequently in Windows 8. So your mileage may vary. You may find that you double click on it and it works with no problem, brings it right up to the front. It really just depends on the mood of the machine at that particular time. All right, so now we'll run through the installer. I'll close this window up too. I won't need that for a while. As you're working through the installer and even some of the labs, this lab in particular, you may find that your machine seems to run a little bit slowly. That's to be expected because you have to keep in mind that you've got an entire virtualization environment running in another virtual machine, and that's consuming a full 2 gigabytes of memory. In fact, for some of you, if you don't actually meet the laptop or system requirements for the class, you may find that that virtual machine will not boot because it needs so much RAM. That's actually one of the reasons that I'm recording these labs, not just to help you as you're working through them, but just in case you find that there's some piece of software or some activity we're doing that just won't work on your machine. Maybe because of security policies at your company, maybe because of the kind of machine you have or the laptop specifications or workstation specifications of your particular machine. So you can always rest on or rely on using these here to see what's happening, but if you can, I really do encourage you to work through the labs on your own and to use the labs as a starting point. Answer the questions that it presents for you, but always think about what you can do to go a little bit further and what kind of other information is available to you based on what you're seeing right now. All right, I just saw it drop an icon out here, so we must be getting pretty close now. All right, finish. So at this point, we've got a vSphere icon sitting on our desktop. So according to the directions there, it's actually step number 11 on page 20. We'll just get this started, and it will prompt us and ask us where it is that we'd like to connect. All we need to do is enter that same IP address. But unlike the web browser, we must also specify the credentials right here. Now, in most environments, you'll probably find that you're going to use your Windows session credentials because those will likely be coming from a domain, which is the right way to manage the access that individuals have within the vSphere environment. In this particular case, though, we're using local credentials because this machine is not talking to any kind of a domain. So we're going to type in root, and we've already discovered that this machine has no password set. So we'll click the login button, and we do get that same kind of warning. This warning here, and we can even view the certificates, even going in and looking at details of the certificate itself. When we take a look at the certificate itself, we can find that there's lots of information available. We can find out how it was issued, where it came from. This one we can tell based on the subject here that this one is the default certificate that came with the ESXi box. So no effort has been made to additionally secure this machine. That's really not a good sign. In any event, let me ignore that for now. Oh, I took too long to click that, so let's try it again. There we are. And that will bring up the ESXi window. Or I'm sorry, the vSphere window. Now in our case, you'll find that you will immediately get a warning because we're giving you an evaluation licensed copy. Actually, there's no license installed at all. So when an ESXi box comes up and there's no license associated with it, that machine is going to last for 60 days. And at the end of 60 days, it's just going to shut itself down. Now ESXi is actually a free product. It's all the other features, like whether or not you can use vMotion and have high availability. All of those are add-on fees. But to use the free product, you still do need to go and register with VMware, because of course they want to be able to market to you. If you do register, they'll give you a serial number that you can then install in the ESXi box and use it for as long as you'd like to. However, we've got some questions we want to answer. So I'm going to close this up. We're now on step number 16 and moving into page number 21. Let me just flip my page. And we've got some questions that it wants to ask us about this. The first question is, it says, there's at least one configuration issue being brought to your attention. What is it? Now the place to find that is usually on the Summary tab. And you'll notice that when I switch over there, let me do that again. Oh, well, it's already populated now. But the first time you click over there, it will take a few seconds, and then easy configuration issues will show up. There's actually something else that's very interesting about this. In this case, it's telling me that the default password has not been changed, and we know that's bad. And usually, this will create a yellow caution sign on the ESXi server itself. But notice here, there's no caution sign. Now that's kind of interesting. I've seen some unpredictable behavior here. I feel pretty confident that if I moved this or joined it into an ESXi vCenter management server, it would show me the caution sign. But I've seen in many cases that, especially when you're reaching out to a machine directly, the caution sign doesn't show up. So if I just started here, and then, well, I don't need to go to Summary, I just want to go and do something with the configuration, it's very easy for me to blaze on by and never know that that's happening. So okay, a stop for us is always going to be the Summary tab to see if there's any common configuration issues. And we don't want to let the administrator click by too fast. Let it sit there for 2 or 3 seconds and see if anything pops up. The next question we've got is about the evaluation status. Now that's easy. We can see it right up here. We can see that currently we're in evaluation mode with 60 days remaining. But we can actually get to this information somewhere else too. I encourage you to move around and browse in this interface and see what you can find. Let's take a look in the Configuration tab, because under Configuration, Licensed Features, that's the other place we can find out what's happening. And in this case, see exactly when it will expire, as well as see all of the things that it can currently do. They're nice enough that during the initial evaluation, pretty much all of the cool features are available. As soon as you assign one of the free licenses, though, you'll see that a lot of these things disappear. Because, of course, they'd like you to license those. They'd like you to pay for them. All right. We've got some other questions here, though. The next question is, how many processor sockets are installed? Now, we can again approach this in a couple of ways. I could come up here into Processors under Configuration, and it shows me that there are 2 processor sockets. That means how many physical processors are there? Well, there's 2. And each one of them has 1 core per socket. Why am I asking you about this? Now, in the lab, we just ask you to find the answer to questions, but in the lab, we don't always tell you why you're looking. I'll tell you why in this case. Because the licensing around VMware has a lot to do with memory and processors. So when you get an enterprise license, you are licensed for an unlimited number of sockets per ESXi box. But if you were to get one of the lower end models, maybe the starter edition, I think you're limited to, I may not have this exactly right because they've changed their licensing model lately, but I think that limits you to 2 physical processors per ESXi box. Though each of those physical processors can have as many cores as you'd like. Maybe a quad core or an oct core, no problem. But only 2 physical processors. This matters because if I have a piece of hardware with 4 physical processors, but my license only permits 2, I've got twice the hardware that I just can't use because we have improperly licensed it. So you should know how to find this. You can also find this information in the Summary tab. It tells you you've got 2 CPU cores, but again, 2 CPUs times, that's telling me the number of cores, but down here is the physical number of sockets, 2 processor sockets. So there's often more than one way to get the information. The next question is asking about the number of NICs that are installed. Now, you might be tempted to look right over here at the network, and you could easily say, well, it looks like there's 3. But this is the number of networks, not the number of network interface cards. Is it possible, for instance, that we actually have 6 network interface cards, each of which has 2 of them bonded together to service each network? Or could we have 2 network cards, one that has 2 networks on it and one that has another network on it? Absolutely. So again, we're finding ourselves going back to the Configuration tab where most of this stuff is. And in this case, we're interested in a hardware question for networking. And when I switch to that, I can see on the left-hand side all of the networks that I have, as well as the virtual switches. And then I can see on the right-hand side the number of physical adapters. In this case, there is only 1 physical adapter in this particular host. This particular network adapter is supporting 2 virtual networks. What about these 2? There's no physical adapter. Does that make any sense? Your first reaction might be no, but it actually does. You see, these are virtual networks, a virtual switch that is entirely virtualized. So I can have hosts on that virtual switch forming their own network. And in order for them to be able to communicate out or with anything else, there would simply have to be a host that has an adapter both on one of these networks and maybe on this network up here, so that there is a physical adapter connected. So it is not unusual to find a set of virtual networks for which there are no physical adapters. Now, it asks if there's any potential findings with regard to this, and the answer is yes. For our particular ESXi host, we don't have any virtual machines, so there's not a lot of concern right now. But if you're going to install ESXi, you're going to do that because you want to put virtual machines on it. And as we talked about, if you could, it would be really wonderful to have a one-to-one relationship between the number of interfaces and the number of hosts. Though that's not probably why you chose to virtualize things. You wanted to reduce hardware requirements. However, the more hosts you add, the more network interfaces you should have, physical adapters. So there is a concern here. The concern is there's only 1 physical adapter for however many virtual machines we install. That probably is not ideal. We should at a minimum have 2, one for the management interface, which you'll notice is bound with the virtual machine network, not a good configuration, and one for the virtual hosts. Even better to have at least 3, one for management, one for the SAN, and one for the virtual network. But we probably want to just add on from that. The more network adapters we can throw at the SAN network, for instance, the better we can get data through that, or pull data through that. Additionally, the more we can put at a physical network, the better throughput we're going to have for all of the virtual machines that we support, in addition to being able to create some failover for those virtual machines. All right. The last question it asks here for this particular section is how many networks are configured. And again, this is something that could mislead you, because simply looking over here, it looks like there's only 3. But when I look under configuration again, let's see now. There's an intranet network, there's a services network, there's a management network, and a VM network. So there are, in fact, 4 configured. Which one's not showing up? Let's take a quick look. VM Services Intranet. The one that doesn't show up is the VM kernel port. Now it's not showing up because it's marked as a VM kernel port only. I'm going to make a little change to this. Oh, I'm looking right at it and I can't see it. So there it is, the management network. Let me edit that, and I am going to add on some additional pieces to that. So I can, for instance, turn on vMotion and fault tolerance. So here's where you can go and see what's actually configured for that. That's fine. I'm going to say I'll continue. And so I can control what kinds of things are happening there. In this particular case, this is an actual network that has its own configuration. But even so, see, here's the IP settings for what addresses will be there, any security or traffic shaping or anything else I'd like to configure. But even so, it's still a management network and doesn't automatically show up in that other window over in the configuration tab. We're also looking at a default here because the default is that the first physical adapter will be both a VM kernel port and a machine port group, which is again not an ideal configuration. You'd prefer to see that the VM kernel port is peeled off on its own private network. Now there are some more questions here that we can answer, and I'm going to go through this a little bit quicker. The first one is how much memory is installed. So right here in the memory tab, we can see very quickly what that is. We can also ask questions about the storage. It wants to know about the total capacity. Well, I can see what that is. It's 3 gigabytes at the moment. It's also asking about the name of the data store. The name of the data store in this case is, well, let's see here. It's over here on the left-hand side, ESXi Internal Data Store. It also wants to know whether or not this is an SSD drive. Now, it may seem strange, but you will see SSD drives in ESXi boxes, and it's quite often used to speed things up, especially when it comes to where the swap is and things like that, because if you're dealing with a SAN, you're probably pushing a lot of data across a network. If you're dealing with things that have to do with the RAM of the virtualized machine, you'd really prefer to keep that local, and even better, on an SSD drive that's going to give you the highest performance. In this case, this is a non-SSD drive. It tells us right on it. It also tells us the type of file system, a VMFS5, which is the next question. All right. The next question is, which networks are connected to the physical network adapter? You know, we've actually already seen that. Let's switch back real quick. We can see it's the one named VM Network and the one named Management Network. It has another question about networks. It would like to know the VLAN ID of the services network. I can see that right over here. 100 is its number. We're going to talk about VLANs and VLAN IDs in probably not the next session, but actually on the Wednesday of that week. So we are coming up to that. Our next question here is IPv6 enabled on VMNIC1? Well, let's find out. So if I go into the properties here of the network adapter, here it is, and I'd like to know whether or not the IPv6 is enabled. Well, let's see here. Currently, the networks supported are 192.168.1 through 192.168.111.254. So a quick, easy answer is, well, those don't look like IPv6 addresses. I could also click on this window, see what kind of other protocols are available or not available. In this case, there are no extra ones available. Cisco Discovery Protocol would be the most common one to find there. I can also take a look at this through some other ways. I could go to the adapter itself. Now, the adapter itself, allows me to see some additional things about it. Observe network ranges. So this is showing me the kinds of networks that it can see right now. Again, we are looking at an IPv4 network. But does any of that conclusively tell me whether or not IPv6 is supported? Well, let's go back to the networking tab for just a moment. If we go to the networking tab, I'd like to point out to you that the VM kernel port has this IP address, but underneath it, we see this address. Now, what's that? Let's come on into here, and let's go into the management network. And when I do, I can see that, oh, look at that. There's an IPv6 address. That's what that big long number is. So how can I actually get my hands on that? How can I see that? Well, if we switch over into the properties, we'll find that IPv6 is supported on this host, which is why IPv6 here is getting populated with an address. So we can say, yes, indeed, this VM NIC 0 does have IPv6 supported. The next question is asking which switch it's connected to, and for that, we're not asking about the physical switch, but instead the virtual switch. In this case, vSwitch 0 is what it's connected to. Next, it wants to know about the time configuration. It says, is there a problem with the time configuration? Well, switching over there, we can see that the answer is absolutely yes. There is no NTP client running, and there are no servers configured. So, in order for these logs to be accurate, and in order for all of the hosts running on this physical hardware to keep their clock synchronized correctly based on the hardware, we really do need to make sure that NTP is configured to go and pull information. The next question asks about authentication. It wants to know whether or not the system will accept domain authentication. And when we switch over here to authentication services, what we find is that directory services, local authentication. This is not currently going to do any authentication into a domain. And just to prove it, we'll pull on into here and we can see that currently it's set for not doing any kind of authentication with the domain. Simply changing it over to Active Directory, though, would allow us to join it into a domain, and I have to put a name in there, of course, and then use the Active Directory itself and leverage using the groups, as we talked about in the class, as a recommendation. Our next question is just a little bit harder to find. It says to answer the following questions, click on the Advanced Settings option under Software. So under Software, Advanced Settings, way down here, and the question is, are the system logs configured to be sent to a remote machine? Well, let's see. If we scroll down, we don't see anything labeled log, but I do see syslog. Syslog, that's the thing that's going to be used to configure where things are being sent. And you can configure way down into very specific things in terms of messages. But it wants to know if they're configured to go to a remote host. And that's actually found at the top level here. It's a global configuration. And you'll see that the syslog global log host is set to 192.168.2.254. I know you were getting used to things not being turned on, but see, that one is actually correct. It is configured to send things to a remote host. What is the current setting for the maximum log size that will cause the logs to be rotated? Well, let's see here. If I scroll down, or actually, do I need to scroll down? No, right here. Number of rotated logs to keep is 8. The default size of logs before rotation in kilobytes is 1024 kilobytes, so this is 1 megabyte. At 1 megabyte, it will rotate the logs. Now, there are lots and lots of other things that you can find in this interface, and there's even different ways of viewing it. For instance, right now we're looking at the standard inventory view, but we could take a look at it as the administration view and take a look at what's happening with users. We could take a look at the logs themselves on the host. There's lots of ways that we can approach the management of this particular box. I encourage you to take some time, browse around, see what other kinds of features are available, because you will find them useful, especially when we get to the audit the flag exercise at the very end of the course. But for now, we've actually found answers to all of the questions. Now, if any of them were unclear, or if you didn't have time to find one of them, I also have the answers printed on page 222 in the workbook. So if you need some additional assistance, you can find it there. Otherwise, that brings us to the end of this first lab. We hope you found that useful. If you have any questions, feel free to grab me during office hours or before class.